The name came to Ruth Bristol in a dream 3 weeks before she ever set eyes on the man who bore it, stitched itself into her sleeping mind, with the gentle insistence of a needle finding its course through soft cotton. And when she woke in the gray-pink light of a Kansas morning in the spring of 1878, she could still feel the weight of those 2 words on her tongue like something she had always known. Clarence Keene. She lay still for a long moment in the narrow bed she had shared with her younger sister Alma for all of her 23 years, listening to the wind push against the thin walls of the Bristol homestead, listening to her father cough in the room beyond the curtain that divided their lives into a kind of privacy they had all agreed to pretend was sufficient. The cough had been getting worse since January. She knew it, and her sister knew it, and her father, Edgar Bristol, knew it most of all, though he never said so directly, because Edgar Bristol was a man who believed that naming a trouble only gave it more room to grow. Ruth rose from the bed without waking Alma, who slept with one hand tucked beneath her cheek in the way she had since she was 4 years old. She dressed in the dark, pulling on her brown wool skirt and her cotton blouse and her boots that needed new soles but would have to wait until the wheat money came in, if the wheat money came in, because the spring had been dry, and the sky had that pale, bleached look that made old farmers squint and shake their heads. She went to the table where her quilting basket sat, as it always did, beside the cold stove. She had been working on a new quilt for 2 months, piecing together scraps of fabric from worn-out garments, from flour sacks, from a length of blue calico she had bartered her best jam for at the general store in Hayes City. The quilt was a log cabin pattern, each block built around a central square, and it was coming along well. She was proud of it in the quiet way she allowed herself to be proud of things, without advertisement or excess. She took out the quilt and spread the working section across her knees and sat in the single chair near the window that caught the first light of day, and she thought about the name from her dream, Clarence Keene. It had no face attached to it, no context, no explanation. It was simply a name, whole and certain as a stone in the hand. Before she could think too hard about what she was doing, she threaded her needle with a length of deep blue thread, the same shade as the calico squares, and she began to embroider the name into a corner of the quilt block she was working on. She made the letters small and careful, the way her mother had taught her, each stitch placed with intention. Clarence, and then, after a breath, Kene, she sat back and looked at what she had done. In the growing light it looked perfectly ordinary, just a name worked into a corner of fabric, the kind of sentimental thing that quilt makers had been doing for generations. People stitched all manner of things into their quilts: dates, Bible verses, the names of children and husbands and the dead. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would work more fabric over it eventually, that it would be hidden beneath other pieces and no one would ever see it. She did not work more fabric over it. Somehow, in all the weeks that followed, that particular corner remained visible, remained right where she had placed it, as though the quilt itself had decided the matter. Hayes City, Kansas in 1878 was a town that was growing up out of its wildest years with the awkward, self-conscious energy of a teenager who had recently been very badly behaved and was now trying to present a respectable face to the world. The cattle drives from Texas still came through, and the cowboys who rode them still came into town with dust in their teeth and money burning holes in their pockets, and there were still saloons enough to accommodate them and enough trouble to go around. But the lawmen were getting more organized. The newspaper was getting printed on better paper. The church congregation was getting bigger every Sunday, and the women who ran the dry goods stores and the millinery and the schoolhouse were quietly, determinedly turning the whole enterprise towards something that looked like civilization. Ruth Bristol was one of those women in her way. She had been teaching the younger children at the Hayes City schoolhouse for 4 years, walking the 3 miles into town and back 6 days a week because the salary, small as it was, kept the Bristol household from going under entirely. She was good at teaching. She was patient and precise, and she had a way of explaining things that made them feel newly discovered rather than merely memorized. The children liked her. Their parents trusted her. She was considered, in the way that frontier communities considered such things, a woman of good character and steady worth. She was also considered, in the way that frontier communities considered such things, a woman who had not yet married, and who was therefore either very selective or suffering from some hidden flaw that had not yet been identified. She was 23 years old, which was not ancient, but in a place where women sometimes married at 16 and were grandmothers at 35, it was the kind of detail that people noticed and occasionally commented upon, with the particular combination of sympathy and nosiness that passed for concern. Ruth did not pay much attention to this. She had been proposed to twice, once by a farmer named Hollies who smelled permanently of cattle and who had 3 small children from a previous marriage, and once by the assistant storekeeper at the dry goods, who was pleasant enough but who she could not imagine waking up next to for 50 years without feeling a deep and fundamental sadness. She had declined both proposals politely, and had gone back to her teaching and her quilting and her father's slow decline and her sister's bright, restless energy, and she had not felt, in any significant way, that she was missing something essential, until the dream, until the name that arrived in her sleeping mind like a message from somewhere she could not locate on any map. It was her friend Dorothea Marsh who first mentioned him. Dorothea was the wife of the blacksmith, a large, warm woman who knew everything that happened in Hayes City approximately 4 hours before it actually happened, and she delivered information the way other people delivered food, with generosity and the quiet certainty that it was needed. "There is a new man taken up at the Renner place," Dorothea said, appearing at Ruth's side after Sunday service with the purposeful air of someone who has been waiting for an appropriate moment. "Bought the eastern 40 acres and the house. He arrived Thursday last." "Is that so?" Ruth said, which was not really a question. "From Missouri, they say, though I have also heard Colorado. He came alone. No wife, no family that anyone can see. He has a horse that is very fine and a wagon that is not." Ruth thought of the name on her quilt. She thought of it with a strange, twisting feeling she could not entirely classify. "What is his name?" she asked, and her voice came out perfectly calm, the way her voice always came out, because Ruth Bristol had spent her whole life in a house where calm was necessary and she had gotten very good at it. "Keene," said Dorothea, watching her with those knowing dark eyes. "Clarence Keene." The silence that followed was probably not as long as it felt to Ruth. A few seconds, perhaps. Dorothea tilted her head slightly. "You've gone rather pale," she observed. "It's warm," Ruth said. "The sun." It was not particularly warm. It was May, and the sky was still doing its bleached, dry thing, and the wind was cool. Dorothea said nothing more about it, but she watched Ruth for the rest of the afternoon with the patient attention of someone who has noticed a thread and is waiting to see what it pulls loose. Ruth went home and took out the quilt and looked at the name she had stitched into the corner and felt, for the first time in her practical and organized life, genuinely unsteady. She was not a superstitious woman. She did not put stock in signs or omens or the particular significance of dreams. She believed in work and practicality and the clear-eyed assessment of what was in front of her. She believed in making decisions based on evidence. But she had stitched his name into her quilt before she ever heard his name spoken aloud, and that was a fact she could not quite talk herself out of. She folded the quilt carefully and put it back in the basket and set about making supper. She did not meet Clarence Keene for another 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, she heard about him in the way you heard about everyone in a town the size of Hayes City, in fragments and pieces, each one adding a small detail to a picture she was building without intending to. He was, by all accounts, a man of about 30 or so, though some said 32 and some said 28, which meant no one actually knew. He had come to Kansas with the intention of farming, which marked him as either brave or ignorant or both, given the state of the spring. He had dark hair and was tall, or he was not especially tall but was broad in the shoulder. He had a way of speaking that was quiet but not unfriendly. He had been seen at the general store buying seed corn and at the hardware buying tools, and once at the edge of town just standing still, looking out at the horizon, the way men did when they were trying to decide if a place was going to become home or just another place they had passed through. Ruth gathered these pieces and did not examine them too closely. She went to school and taught the children their letters and their arithmetic. She went home and cooked and cleaned and sat with her father in the evenings, while he tired more quickly than he used to, and his cough carved a little more of him away each week. She worked on the quilt, carefully, methodically, building the pattern outward from the blocks she had completed, and when she reached the block with the name on it, she worked around it the way water works around a stone. The day she met him was a Wednesday, late in the afternoon, when the school day was finished, and she was walking home along the road that cut through the south edge of town. She had her school bag over one shoulder and a book she was intending to use for Friday's lesson tucked under her arm, and she was thinking about her father and whether she ought to ask the doctor to come again, which cost money they did not readily have, when a wagon came up behind her on the road. "Excuse me," said the man on the wagon seat. "Miss, I wonder if you could tell me the direction of the Bristol homestead. I have been told there is a Miss Bristol who does fine sewing work, and I am in need of someone who can mend a coat." Ruth stopped walking. She turned around. The wagon had pulled up beside her, and the man holding the reins was looking down at her with the patient, slightly uncertain expression of someone who is not entirely sure of the local customs. He was, she noticed, neither as tall as some had said nor as short as others had suggested. He was somewhere in between, with dark hair that could have used a barber's attention and eyes that were a complicated shade she could not immediately name, something between brown and green, and a jaw that was set with the kind of quiet steadiness that she recognized because it was the same quality she tried to maintain in herself. He was perhaps 29, perhaps 30. He was wearing a coat that was, in fact, in need of mending, with a torn seam at the shoulder that had been clumsily pinned. "I am Ruth Bristol," she said. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind where two people are taking in a fact and letting it settle. He looked at her steadily, without embarrassment. She looked back. "Well," he said, "that is convenient. I do take in mending," she said, "and other sewing work. You can bring the coat to the schoolhouse any morning or to the homestead on Saturdays." "I'm Clarence Keene," he said. "I've taken up the Renner place." "I know," she said, and then felt the particular discomfort of having revealed that she'd been paying attention. "The town is not large," she added. "People know when someone new arrives." He nodded, accepting this without apparent discomfort. "I'll bring the coat Saturday if that suits." "Saturday suits," she said. She walked the rest of the way home with the awareness that she had just spoken to the man whose name she had stitched into her quilt without knowing his face, and the awareness was so strange and insistent that she had to stop once at the bend in the road and just stand still for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the top of the fence post, until the strangeness subsided to a manageable level. She did not tell anyone about the quilt. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. He came on Saturday, as he had said he would. Ruth was outside hanging laundry when he arrived, and she heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular sound of that horse's footfall, which she had apparently already memorized without meaning to. She took her time finishing the sheet she was hanging before she turned around, because she was Ruth Bristol, and she did not allow herself to rush. Her father was sitting on the porch in his wooden chair, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth, and he was watching Clarence Keene climb down from the wagon with the attentive, slightly proprietary air of a man whose daughters have been too long without prospects, and who is therefore paying close attention to every new arrival. "Mr. Keene," Ruth said, drying her hands on her apron. "This is my father, Edgar Bristol." "Sir," Clarence said, and went to the porch with his hat in his hand, which was the right thing to do, and Edgar Bristol visibly thawed several degrees. "You're the one took up the Renner place," Edgar said. "Yes, sir, Eastern 40. "Dry," Edgar said. Yes, sir, I've been digging to see what the water situation looks like. Renner couldn't make a go of it, Edgar said. I've heard that. I'm hoping the situation has changed somewhat. Edgar looked at him for a long moment with the measuring look of a man who has been farming difficult land for 30 years. Could have, he said, which was approximately the highest praise Edgar Bristol extended to an uncertain proposition. Ruth took the coat and went inside to look at the mending, and she could hear through the open window her father talking to Clarence Keene in the slow, deliberate way he talked when he was actually interested in something, asking about the land and the water and what crops Keene intended to plant, and Clarence answering in that same quiet way he had, without excess, without the performing quality that some men put on when they were trying to impress. He said what he thought. He said when he didn't know. He said he was hoping for the best but preparing for difficulty, which was the only sensible approach to farming in Kansas in a dry year, and which was also, Ruth thought, pressing her thumb along the torn seam of his coat, a pretty good philosophy for most things. The coat was straightforward work, a torn shoulder seam and a missing button and a fraying cuff that she could turn and rehem. She could have it ready by Tuesday. She went back outside with this information and found her father and Clarence Keene in conversation with the ease of two people who have discovered an unexpected common ground. Tuesday, she said. There is also some fraying at the cuff that I can fix without extra charge. He looked at her with those complicated eyes. That's kind of you, he said. It's practical, she said. The cuff will give way within a month if it's not addressed. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. I appreciate practical, he said. He paid her in advance, which she had not asked for, and he left, and Edgar Bristol watched the wagon go down the road with the look of a man who is filing information away for future reference. Steady sort, her father said. He seems so, Ruth agreed. Ask him to supper, Edgar said. Father. A man alone needs feeding same as anyone, Edgar said, with the entirely unconvincing implication that his interest was charitable rather than strategic. Ask him next time he comes. Ruth decided not to argue about this. She went back inside and picked up the coat and began removing the old stitching from the shoulder seam with her small scissors, and she told herself very firmly that she was simply doing her work, and that the quilt and the dream and the name were all coincidence, and that she would not make more of them than they were. She lasted approximately 4 days in this resolution before she took the quilt out and looked at the name again. Clarence Keene. Small, careful letters in deep blue thread on a background of pieced cotton. She ran her finger along the stitching the way you run your finger along something you want to understand better. She put the quilt away again and went to bed. Tuesday came and he arrived for his coat, and she had it ready, pressed and mended, and the cuff turned as she had promised. And she had also, without quite planning to, made a small pot of coffee and had it on the stove, because it was a cold morning and it was the kind of thing you offered. He accepted the coffee and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, because the inside of the house was not quite the place for a man who was not family, not yet, and they talked for 20 minutes about the weather and the school, and whether the wheat was going to survive the dry spell, and whether the cattle market was going to improve now that the worst of the trail drive fights had settled down. He was easy to talk to. That surprised her more than anything else about him. She had expected something more difficult, given the strange weight the dream had put on him before she ever met him. She had expected him to be either disappointing, which would have been a relief, or overwhelmingly significant, which would have been uncomfortable. Instead, he was simply a man who was thoughtful and direct, and who listened when she spoke, which was not as common as it ought to have been, and who laughed in a low, genuine way when something struck him as funny, and who looked at the land and the sky with the particular attention of someone who is learning to read a new language and knows that missing a word could cost them everything. He asked about her teaching. She told him about the school, the 30 or so children who came when their parents could spare them from farm work, the challenge of teaching 7 different grade levels in a single room, the particular pleasure of the moment when a child understood something they had been struggling with and their whole face changed. "What made you want to teach?" he asked. "My mother taught me," she said. "She died when I was 12. I suppose I wanted to do for other children what she did for me." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "It was a long time ago," she said, which was true but which also, she knew, did not quite cover the whole of it. "Did she teach you the sewing too?" "Yes." He looked at the coat she had returned to him, at the neat, invisible work of the mended seam. "She taught you well," he said, and said it simply, without extra decoration, and it landed in Ruth's chest with the weight of something real. He came back the following Saturday, not because he had more mending, but because Edgar Bristol had apparently taken matters into his own hands and mentioned, at the general store, that there was an open invitation to supper at the Bristol place. Ruth heard this from Dorothea, who heard it from the storekeeper's wife, and she was torn between exasperation at her father and a complicated feeling that was not entirely displeasure. She made a proper meal: roast chicken that cost them more than they usually spent, and biscuits, and the last of the apple preserves from fall. Alma was home for the weekend from her position as a lady's maid in Hayes City proper, and she sat across the table from Clarence Keene and watched him with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to be subtle about her assessments. "Are you going to stay?" Alma asked him, approximately 7 minutes into the meal. "Alma," Ruth said. "It's a fair question," Alma said. "Lots of men come through and talk about staying and then they don't." Clarence looked at Alma with the calm expression he seemed to bring to most situations. "I intend to stay," he said. "I put most of what I had into the land. It would be impractical to leave." "Practical," Alma said, glancing at Ruth with an expression that Ruth recognized as meaningful and chose to ignore. "Ruth likes practical." "Alma," Ruth said again. "She does," Alma said to Clarence, entirely unabashed. "She's the most practical person I know. She mended our fence with her bare hands last winter because the fence man wanted too much money. She taught herself to do it from a book." Clarence looked at Ruth with something that was unmistakably appreciation. "Is that so?" he said. "The book was very clear," Ruth said, and hated that she could feel warmth in her face. Edgar Bristol, sitting at the head of the table with his blanket across his knees even inside, watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose plan is proceeding according to design. After supper, while Alma and Edgar sat inside and the evening came down gold and cool across the flat Kansas land, Ruth and Clarence stood on the porch and looked at the horizon in the companionable silence of two people who have run out of small talk and discovered that the silence is not uncomfortable. "Your father is unwell," Clarence said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Ruth said. "The lungs since winter." "Is there family besides you and your sister?" "No, our mother's family is in Ohio. I haven't seen them since I was a girl." He was quiet. She was aware of him standing just to her left, close enough that she could have touched his arm without fully extending hers. She did not. "If there is anything I can do," he said, "for the property, fencing or the like. I have the time in the evenings." She wanted to say she didn't need help, which was what she always said, which was what you said because asking for help meant admitting need and admitting need meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in a dry Kansas spring with a sick father and a property running thin was the kind of thing that could pull you under if you let it. "The south well needs looking at," she said instead. "The lining may need work. I haven't been able to get to it." "I'll come Thursday," he said. He came Thursday. He came the following Tuesday. He came most Saturdays through June, always with a reason, always with something practical to address: the well and then a fence section, and then the roof over the barn that had been letting water in. Ruth worked alongside him when she could, and when she could not she brought him coffee and watched him work with the competent, unhurried efficiency of a man who was comfortable with labor and comfortable with silence in equal measure. She noticed things about him in the way that you notice things when you are trying not to look too directly. The way he wiped his hands on his trousers before he picked something up that deserved care. The way he went still and attentive when her father spoke, honoring the slowness that illness imposed. The way he looked at the land, her father's land and his own, with the same expression, as though he was already thinking of them as part of the same story. She noticed that he did not speak about his life before Kansas except in brief, functional references. Missouri or Colorado or both, she did not know. She did not ask directly, because the frontier had its own etiquette about the past, and a man's right to begin again without full accounting was considered a matter of basic decency. But she noticed the absence and filed it away. Dorothea came to tea in the third week of June and sat across the kitchen table from Ruth with the expression of a woman who has patience in abundance and is choosing to exercise it strategically. "You are going to tell me something," Ruth said. "I am going to ask you something," Dorothea corrected. "Which is different. How are things proceeding with Mr. Keene? He is helping with some repairs on the property. He has been here 6 times in the last month. There were a number of things needing attention." "Ruth," Dorothea said, with the particular gentle insistence of someone who has been a friend long enough to earn directness. "Do you like him?" Ruth looked at her tea. She thought about the quilt. She thought about the name she had stitched in the dark of an early morning before she ever knew his face. She thought about the way he had said her mother had taught her well, simply and without excess, and the weight it had carried. "Yes," she said, "I do." Dorothea smiled the smile of someone who has been waiting for exactly this answer. "Does he know?" "I have no idea what he knows," Ruth said. "He is not easy to read in that particular regard." "He comes 6 times in a month," Dorothea said. "He is not coming for the well." Ruth did not respond to this, but she felt the warmth in her face again and was glad she had her back to the window. The thing that changed the nature of the situation, as things in that time and place tended to do, was a piece of weather. It came on a Friday night at the end of June, a storm that had been building on the western horizon since midday, and that hit the Kansas plains with the particular violence of a thunderstorm that has had all of that flat, open country to gather itself in. The lightning was extraordinary, blue-white and enormous, cracking down on the dark fields in a way that made the earth itself seem fragile. The rain came in torrents and the wind came with it, and by the time it was over in the small hours of the morning, it had taken half the roof off the Bristol barn. Ruth went out at first light to assess the damage and found it was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared, which was the best that could be said for most of the difficult things she had faced in her life. The hay inside was wet but not destroyed. The walls were standing. The horses were safe, having been let into the linta before the storm. But the roof section was gone, and the exposed beams were already warping in the morning sun that was following the storm with cheerful indifference to the damage it had preceded. She had her hands on her hips and was doing the mathematics of repair versus cost versus available help when she heard a horse on the road and turned to see Clarence Keene coming down at a trot, pulling up at the fence and swinging down with the efficiency of a man who has assessed a situation from the road and arrived with a purpose. "I saw it from my place," he said. "The roof section." "Yes," she said. He looked at the barn. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she had not quite seen there before, something more direct than his usual careful steadiness. "I can fix it," he said. "I'll need to get materials from town. I can go today." "That will cost money I don't currently have," she said, because she was Ruth Bristol and she was honest about her circumstances even when it was uncomfortable. "I have credit at the hardware," he said. "We can settle it later." "Clarence," she said, and realized as she said his name for the first time that she had not said it before, had been using Mr. Keene with the propriety of a woman who knows the weight of first names. "I cannot ask you to do that." "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." She looked at him in the early morning light, the storm-washed air still clean and cold around them, the damaged barn behind her, and she understood in the plain and uncomplicated way she understood most things that he was not here simply out of neighborly generosity. He was here because he wanted to be. He was here because she was here. "I will pay you back," she said. "You'll figure out a way," he said in the tone of someone who considers this sufficiently settled. "Now, can you draw me a rough measurement of that roof section? Or would you rather I measured it myself?" She measured it herself, because she was precise and she knew the exact numbers, and she gave him the paper with the figures written in her neat teacher's hand, and he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and rode to town. He came back with timber and shingles and two of his own tools, and he worked through the day with the focused, steady energy of a man with a clear purpose. Ruth worked alongside him for the portions she could manage and left him to the heights. Alma came out at noon with water and cold biscuits, and sat on the fence watching with undisguised admiration that had nothing to do with the quality of the carpentry, which was also excellent. By evening the roof section was repaired, rough but sound, and Clarence Keene was standing in the yard with sawdust in his hair and a streak of tar on his forearm, and Ruth brought him water and they stood in the gold evening light and looked at the barn together. "Thank you," she said. "That is insufficient as thanks, but it is what I have." He looked at her. The look was different from his usual looks, more open, less guarded. "You could have supper with me," he said. "At my place, Sunday, if you're willing." Yes. The invitation was careful, and the care in it was itself a kind of revelation, because she understood that he was asking something larger than supper, and doing it this way, this measured, practical way, because he understood her well enough to know that this was how she would want it asked. "I would like that," she said. Sunday came and she walked the mile and a half to the Renner place, which was no longer the Renner place, but was now in the process of becoming something else, something that had Clarence Keene's particular quality of quiet care worked into every part of it. The yard was clean and organized. The fence was in better repair than it had been since old Renner built it. The kitchen garden was small but productive, the plants set in straight rows with the kind of attention that meant he had thought carefully about what he was doing. He had cooked. It was simple, beans and cornbread and some late spring greens from the garden, but he had set the table with care, and there was a small glass jar on the table with some wildflowers in it, the yellow prairie kind that came up after rain, and the sight of that jar of flowers did something to Ruth's practical and guarded heart that all the meals and all the conversations and all the weeks of growing familiarity had been building toward. They ate and talked, and the talk was easy and wide-ranging, about books they had read and places they had been, about the particular quality of Kansas light in the evening, and the sounds the prairie made at night. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of four, on a farm near the Missouri River that had flooded twice in his childhood, and that had made him understand, young, that the land was not promised to you no matter how much work you put into it. He told her about going west after his father died, trying Colorado for a few years, finding the mining life not suited to him, coming back east to the plains because the plains were what he understood and what he wanted. He did not tell her everything. She understood there were things he held back, not out of deception but out of the measured privacy of a man who had learned to be careful with himself. She did not press. She had her own things she held back. When the evening was done and she stood to leave, he walked her to the gate and they stood there in the warm dark with the stars enormous overhead the way they were on the plains, where there was nothing to compete with them. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Because I think you prefer directness." "I do," she said. "I have been coming to your place these past weeks for reasons that have nothing to do with fences or wells." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Are you opposed to that?" "No," she said, "I am not." Another silence, but this one had a different quality, the quality of something shifting into a new position, something settling into place. "Good," he said. She walked home in the dark, and the stars were enormous, and the prairie was loud with insects, and the warmth of the evening had not quite left the air. And she felt something she did not have a precise word for, something that was not quite happiness because it was too complicated for that, too braided through with uncertainty, and the weight of her father's illness and the strangeness of the dream, and the name she had stitched before she knew his face. but something that was in the same country as happiness and moving toward the center of it. She went home and took out the quilt and looked at the name, Clarence Keene. She pressed her thumb along the stitching the way she had done before, but this time it felt different. This time it felt less like a mystery and more like the beginning of an answer. The summer deepened and so did the courtship, though it was courtship of the most practical and earnest kind, without grand gestures or elaborate performance, because that was not who either of them was. He continued to come to the Bristol place, and she continued to visit his, and between them they established a rhythm that felt increasingly natural and increasingly necessary. She watched him with her father, and this was perhaps where she felt it most clearly. Edgar Bristol was a man who had been shrinking since winter, the illness taking small portions of him each week, and the diminishment was visible to anyone who looked. Clarence looked. He looked steadily and without flinching, and without the particular kind of pity that was really just discomfort dressed up in softer clothes. He talked to Edgar as he always had, with the full attention of a man who considered the conversation worth having, and Edgar responded to this with something that looked, in his thin, reduced way, like relief. "He's a good man," Edgar told Ruth, one evening when Clarence had gone. He said it the way he said most important things, briefly and without decoration, as though the directness was itself a mark of the gravity he attached to it. "I believe so," Ruth said. "Your mother would have liked him," Edgar said. He turned his face toward the window and the evening light. "She had a way of knowing." Ruth said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. In August, when the wheat had struggled through the dry summer to something worth harvesting, and the heat was at its most absolute, and the days stretched long and hammering across the flat land, Clarence asked Ruth to ride out with him to the far edge of his property where he had found a seasonal creek that still had water in it, a rarity in that dry year. And they sat on the bank in the shade of a stand of cottonwood trees, and listened to the water moving and the cottonwood leaves doing their particular silver and green flickering in the breeze. And the whole afternoon had the quality of something that was happening at a slight remove from ordinary time. They had been talking about the school, about a student of Ruth's named Thomas who had a gift for mathematics that exceeded anything she could adequately teach, and she had been thinking aloud about whether she could write to the college at Lawrence for advice, when Clarence said, "Ruth." She stopped. The way he said her name had a different quality than usual. She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, not at her, with that set jaw and that complicated colored gaze, and she could see him arranging something, organizing what he wanted to say with the same care he brought to organizing his tools before a job. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. He turned to look at her then, and the full weight of those eyes was something she felt physically, a warmth across her sternum, a steadiness in her blood. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not as a practical arrangement. I want to be clear about that. I know you are practical, and I know I have been very practical about all of this, about coming to fix your roof and your well and your fences, and I want you to know that was not calculation. Or not only calculation. I wanted to be useful to you, because I wanted to be near you, and usefulness was the honest way in." She looked at him and felt the whole strange arc of the thing, from the dream in February to this August afternoon, the name stitched in deep blue thread, the weeks of coffee and conversation, and his hands on the fence posts of her father's property. She thought about how strange it was that she had known his name before she knew anything else about him, and she thought about how much less strange it felt now that she did know him. "I have something to show you," she said, which was not the response he had expected. She could see that from the careful stillness that crossed his face, the patience with which he held himself while he waited to understand what she meant. "All right," he said. "Not here," she said. "At home. Will you come on Saturday? I want to show you something, and I want to do it properly." "Saturday," he said, with the steadiness he brought to everything. "Yes." They sat by the creek for another hour without addressing the thing directly again. But it was there between them, warm and certain, and the cottonwood leaves flickered, and the water ran thin but persistent over the creek stones, and the afternoon light moved through gold toward the first hints of evening, and Ruth Bristol felt the future arranging itself with a clarity she had not allowed herself to feel before. Saturday came, and she had the quilt out on the table when he arrived, the whole of it spread flat in the good light of the kitchen window, almost finished now, the log cabin blocks nearly complete, the pattern of warm and cool colors building toward its center. She had left the block with his name visible, had not covered it, had decided sometime in the past months that she would not. He came in and looked at the quilt on the table with the polite appreciation he would have extended to any piece of her work, and then she pointed to the corner of the block, the small, careful letters in deep blue thread. He bent to look. She watched his face. He read it. He went very still. He bent lower, close enough that she could see the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was thinking hard about something. "That's my name," he said. "Yes," she said. He straightened. He looked at her. "When did you put this here?" "February," she said. "Before I had met you." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind or the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that comes when someone is encountering something that does not fit inside the available categories. "Before I came to Hayes City," he said. "You arrived in May," she said. "I stitched it in February. I dreamed your name and I woke up and I wrote it into the quilt. I don't have an explanation for it. I'm not a person who goes in for signs or superstitions, but that is what happened." He looked at the quilt. He reached out and touched the stitching with his fingers, pressing his thumb along the letters the way she had done herself so many times, and she watched his face and saw something she had not seen there before, something entirely unguarded, something that looked like the moment just before a man decides to stop being careful. When he looked up at her, his eyes were different than usual. Not different in character. He was still the same steady, private, measured man, but different in degree, as though something that had been held at a certain level was now higher. "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" she said. "Yes," he said, "is the answer to what I asked you by the creek on Tuesday." She felt the warmth spread through her chest and up into her throat. "I haven't answered you yet," she said. "You showed me the quilt," he said. "That's an answer." She looked at him for a long moment. He was right, she supposed, in the way that he was often right about things that did not require a great many words. She had shown him the quilt, because she wanted him to understand that this had not begun with fences and wells and practical proximity. It had begun somewhere she could not explain, somewhere outside of ordinary cause and effect, and she needed him to know that before she said yes, because yes would mean everything, and she wanted it to mean everything truly. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He crossed the space between them and took her hands in his, both of them, and looked at her with all that unguarded steadiness, and she had the sensation of arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it for a very long time. He touched the stitching on the quilt one more time that morning, with her name next to his without knowing it, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, as though the weight of a thing he had been carrying without acknowledgement had been redistributed into something more bearable. She would think about that moment later, many times. The way he touched that stitch. The way he never quite recovered from the strangeness of it, the inexplicable, ungovernable fact that she had known his name before she knew him, that she had written it into a thing made to keep a person warm, and that this, of all things, was what had undone the last of his careful distance. They told Edgar Bristol that afternoon. He was on the porch in his chair, and his face did something complicated when they came out together and Ruth spoke, something that moved through surprise and then through a deep, private relief, and then through what Ruth recognized as grief, the grief of a father who knows he will not be there to see everything he would like to see. "Good," Edgar said, which was what Edgar said when something was more than good. He looked at Clarence with eyes that were watery with more than the autumn cold that was beginning to come into the evenings. "You'll take care of her." "Yes, sir," Clarence said. "She'll take care of herself," Edgar said. "She always has." But there's taking care and then there's being worth taking care of, and I mean the second one. Clarence understood this, as he understood most things that were said with weight behind them. I do too, he said. They set the date for October, which gave them 2 months, which was not a great deal of time, but which was also, given Edgar's declining condition, time they did not want to waste. There was a great deal to do, and Ruth threw herself into it with the organized energy of a woman who is good at managing what is in front of her, and who has also, privately, been thinking about what she would want from a wedding for long enough to have clear ideas. She finished the quilt. In the last 2 weeks of September, she worked on it every evening after everything else was done, and the final blocks came together with a kind of inevitability that felt appropriate. The log cabin pattern, the warm and cool colors building from the center, the name still visible in its corner if you knew where to look, which she did, and now he did, and no one else needed to. Dorothea Marsh, who had been watching all of this unfold with the deep satisfaction of someone whose instincts have been thoroughly vindicated, threw a small gathering for Ruth in the last week of September, and the women who came brought food and conversation, and in some cases tears, and Dorothea's daughter sang a hymn that was not strictly appropriate for the occasion, but which everyone agreed was beautifully done. Ruth sat in the middle of all of this warmth and friendship, and felt it settle around her like a garment fitted to her measure. She had spent so much of the past years being the person who managed things, who was reliable and steady, and who held the pieces of her family together with both hands, that she had not always had room to receive things. She practiced receiving them now, the food and the conversation and the good wishes, and she found that it was not as difficult as she had imagined. Alma came home for the wedding weekend and could barely contain herself, arriving with her hat askew and her eyes bright, and talking at twice her usual speed about everything she had seen and heard in town. She had brought Ruth a gift of fine white cotton that she had been saving from her wages, and she hugged her sister with an intensity that conveyed everything she could not quite organize into words. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing he's ever seen," Alma whispered, in the moment before the ceremony began and they were standing just inside the church door, and Ruth was trying to hold herself together. "And you look at him like the world finally makes sense. That's what I want." "That's exactly what I want someday." Ruth squeezed her sister's hand. "You'll have it," she said. The wedding was on the 15th of October, 1878, at the church in Hayes City, on a morning that was cold and bright and very clear, the sky a deep autumn blue without a cloud in it. The congregation was small but substantial. The people who had come to matter in the 5 years Ruth had been teaching in the town, Dorothea and her husband, the parents of some of her students, the storekeeper and his wife, the doctor who had been tending Edgar Bristol, some of Clarence's neighbors who had found in the months since his arrival that he was the kind of man you liked without quite being able to say exactly why, except that he was solid and honest, and he did what he said he would do. Edgar Bristol was there, carried in from the wagon by Clarence himself, and settled in a chair at the front of the church, wrapped in the quilt, the one Ruth had finished, the one with his son-in-law's name stitched into the corner. She had given it to him that morning before they left for the church, and he had looked at the stitching for a long moment with the same wondering steadiness Clarence had shown, and then he had wrapped it around himself and said, quietly, that it was the finest piece of work she had ever done. "It kept the right name," she said. "It did," he agreed. The ceremony was short and full. The minister was a man named Aldridge who had been in Hayes City for 3 years, and who had buried enough people in that time to understand that weddings were not the beginning of something simple, but rather the beginning of something large and real, and worth the weight of the words he used. He said the words carefully, and Ruth and Clarence said theirs back to him with the same care. And when Clarence said, "I do," he looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his version of everything he did not say out loud. She looked back at him and said her own "I do" with all the clarity she had, and the quilt was in her father's lap at the front of the church, and the name was stitched into it, and the man was standing in front of her, and the thing had come full circle in a way that she could not have predicted in February, and could not have planned, and which was, she thought, the truest argument she could imagine for the existence of something that moved through time in ways that ordinary logic could not quite account for. They were married. They walked back down the aisle together and out into the October morning, and the light was brilliant and cold, and the people who had come spilled out after them with warmth and noise, and Alma was crying with her hand over her mouth, and Dorothea was smiling with the enormous satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something important, and Clarence had his hand on Ruth's back, warm through the wool of her dress, and the horses were stamping in the cold air, and it was, by any measure, a good morning. The celebration that followed was simple and warm, held at the Marsh house because it was the largest of the houses available to them. There was food and there was music from a fiddle player named Darcy, who was no great talent, but who knew how to keep a room moving, and there was dancing on the wooden floor and the sound of children running through the side rooms, and Edgar Bristol sat in his quilted warmth and watched his eldest daughter dance with her husband, and had an expression on his face that Ruth caught once from across the room and would carry with her for the rest of her life. She danced with Clarence, and he was not a practiced dancer, but he was steady on his feet, and he turned her with a care that was the same quality as everything else he did, the attentive, unhurried quality of a man who is giving something his full attention. They were close, and the fiddle was playing something that was not complicated but was sweet, and she had her hand in his and his other hand at her waist, and the room was warm and full of the noise of people who were genuinely glad for something, which was its own rare gift. "Are you happy?" he said, close to her ear, quietly, just for her. "Yes," she said. She considered adding more but decided that yes was enough. It was the cleanest word she had. She felt him smile against her hair, not the small beginning of a smile she had noticed in the early weeks, a full one. She knew the difference now. They moved to his property after the wedding, which was the logical course, as his house was larger and in better repair than the Bristol place. The plan was that Edgar would remain at the Bristol homestead, with Alma coming to tend to him as she could, and that Ruth would come every day, and that Clarence would help with the property in ways Edgar's condition no longer allowed him to handle himself. This arrangement worked because everyone involved made it work, which was how most arrangements in that time and place succeeded or failed. Ruth continued to teach at the school through the fall, walking the revised distance from the Keene property, which was slightly farther but not unmanageable. Clarence tended his land and helped with hers, and was at Edgar Bristol's side every Thursday afternoon, sitting with him in the way that good men sit with the dying, without drama or performance, just present. Edgar Bristol died in December, quietly, in his chair on the porch with the quilt across his knees, on a cold, still afternoon when the sky was the gray-white of snow not yet arrived. Ruth was with him when he went. Clarence was there too, standing just behind her with his hand on her shoulder, steady and present the way she had come to understand he would always be. She cried once briefly, after they had done what needed to be done, and then she put herself back together and did the things that needed doing, because that was what she was capable of and what she required of herself. Later that night, in the dark and warmth of their bedroom, she cried again, not briefly, and Clarence held her with the solid, unhurried patience he brought to everything that mattered, and did not tell her she would be all right, because he was not a man who offered assurances he could not guarantee, but held on and was there and was enough. She folded the quilt the next morning and put it at the foot of their bed, where it had been since they moved to his property, where it would remain. The name was still there in its corner, Clarence Keene, deep blue thread on pieced cotton. She touched it once in the early morning light, and felt the whole long strange arc of it, the dream and the needle and the thread, and the months of not knowing, and then the knowing that came all at once by a creek in August with cottonwood leaves overhead. The winter was hard, which winters on the Kansas plains generally were. The snow came in January and covered the land in the flat, unbroken way of prairie snow, making the world larger and quieter and more severe. Ruth and Clarence were in the house more than the summer had allowed, and they discovered in those long winter evenings things about each other that the seasons of practical outdoor labor had not quite shown them. He read, which she had suspected but now confirmed, slowly and with great attention, the same way he did everything. He had a modest collection of books, acquired in various places in his traveling years, and she had her own from her teaching, and they traded them and discussed them by the fire with the ease of two people whose minds worked in compatible ways, not identically but complementarily, the way two different instruments could play the same piece and make it richer for the difference. He told her more, in the winter, about Colorado, about the mining town he had lived in for 2 years, a place called Garnet Creek that no longer existed in any meaningful sense because the vein had run out and the people had gone. He had had a partner in a small claim, a man named Davies who had been his closest friend, who had died in a collapse in the spring of 1876. He said this without flourish, as a fact, but she could hear in the plainness of it the weight that it still carried. "I'm sorry about Davies," she said. "He was a good man," Clarence said. "Funny, he could make a joke out of almost anything. I missed that when I left Colorado. The ability to laugh at things. The sense that difficulty didn't have to be entirely dignified," he said. "Davies would have had something to say about my attempts at farming a dry 40 acres that would have made me actually feel better about it." She looked at him across the fire. "I can try," she said. He looked back, surprised. And then he laughed, the low, genuine laugh she had catalogued from the beginning, and the sound of it in the winter room was warm as the fire. They learned each other in the winter. She learned that he was not a morning person in the way she was, but would, once fully awake, function with complete competence for the entire rest of the day. He learned that she needed 20 minutes of quiet after coming home from school before she was ready to talk, and that this was not distance, but rather decompression, the particular psychic quieting required after spending a day inhabiting the full attention of 30 children. He made her tea during those 20 minutes without comment and placed it within her reach and went back to whatever he had been doing. And this small, unremarked act of recognition became one of the things she loved most about the life they were making. She also discovered something she had not expected, which was that love, the actual constant presence of it in ordinary daily life, was nothing like what she had been led to believe from the novels she had read and the stories she had heard. It was less grand and more pervasive. It was in the tea, and in the way he held the door, and in the way he looked at her across the supper table when she said something that struck him as interesting. And it was in the patience with which she sat with him on the cold evenings when the weight of Davies and the collapsed mine, and the years before Kansas, was on him in the particular heavy way of grief that had been carried a long time without complete resolution. In the spring, when the land thawed and the planting began, something had shifted between them that they both noticed and neither named, the way you don't name things that are structural because to name them would make them fragile. They worked the land together, his 40 and the Bristol 40 that he was now managing, and the work was physical and demanding and satisfying in the irreducible way that farming could be when it was working. And this spring had rain, real rain, the kind that came in at the right times and in the right amounts, which in Kansas was enough to make you feel that the land had decided to be on your side for a season. In May, almost exactly a year after Ruth had first seen him on the road with his torn coat and his uncertain expression, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, before the day had fully organized itself, when he was still on his first cup of coffee and the light was low and golden. She said it plainly, because she was Ruth and plainness was what she trusted. He went still in the way he did when he was taking in something significant. Then he set down his coffee cup very carefully, as though his hands needed an occupation for the moment it took him to process the information, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something entirely open and entirely unguarded, something that looked like a man seeing something he had not quite allowed himself to hope for arriving anyway, without his permission, and finding that he was not sorry. He stood up from the table and came to her and put both his hands on her face, cupping it with the careful attention he brought to things that mattered, and he looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "Ruth," he said, and her name in his mouth had all the weight of everything he did not typically put into speech. "Yes," she said. Her throat was very tight, but her eyes were dry because she was Ruth Bristol and she was managing herself. Then she looked at him looking at her, and the management slipped, just slightly, just enough for the moisture in her eyes to be visible, which was approximately as much vulnerability as she typically permitted in the presence of other people. He pulled her into him and held her there with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly what he is holding and intends to keep it safe, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which she had been learning all winter was something she was allowed. "A child," he said, against her hair. "October, I expect," she said. "I will ask the doctor next week." "We'll ask the doctor next week," he said. The child was born in October, almost exactly 1 year to the day after their wedding, which the Hayes City community found particularly notable, and which Dorothea Marsh found romantically significant and mentioned on every available occasion. He was a boy, small and ferocious, and equipped from his first hour with a voice that could be heard at considerable distances, and they named him Edgar Keene in honor of the grandfather he would never remember, which seemed to Ruth the right way to carry the name forward, in a new person with a new life ahead of him. Alma came for the birth and for the weeks following, and the Bristol house was full in the way it had not been since Edgar died, full with Alma's bright, irreverent presence, and the baby's imperious demands and Clarence moving through all of it, with the steady equanimity of a man who is somewhat shocked by the fact that he has a family and is quietly delighted about it. Ruth watched him with the baby and felt the kind of love that was almost too large for the ordinary chest, the kind that made you look at a specific ordinary moment, a man in a chair by the window with an infant on his arm, and understand that you are in the middle of something that is worth every difficult thing it cost to get here. The school was held by a substitute during her recovery, and she returned in December when the baby was sleeping with something approaching regularity, and when Clarence had arranged with the woman who lived a half-mile down the road, a widow named Mrs. Callahan, to come in the mornings when Ruth was teaching. The arrangement required a reordering of the household economy that they accomplished together, as they accomplished most things, with a clear-eyed assessment of what was possible and a willingness to adjust. The spring of 1880 was the best growing season they had seen, the rain coming correctly and the wheat coming in full, and Clarence and Ruth paid off the debt on the materials from the barn repair, and the debt at the hardware store from the seed corn purchase that first summer, and began for the first time to have money that was not immediately required for something else. This was not a large amount of money, but it was enough to feel like foundation, like the beginning of something that would compound over time. He bought her a proper sewing table for the new year, the first new piece of furniture they had purchased since their marriage, and presented it with the sheepishness of a man who has spent money on something that could be considered an indulgence and is uncertain how this will be received. She looked at it for a moment. It was well-made solid oak with 2 drawers and a fold-out surface and a small shelf underneath for baskets. She ran her hand along the top. "It's too much," she said. "It's not," he said. "You earn half what this household runs on and you sew at a kitchen chair. It's practical." She looked at him. He had the slightly defensive expression of someone who knows he is going to win an argument but has chosen an angle they find somewhat vulnerable. "Practical," she said. "Entirely practical," he said with great firmness. She kissed him, which was the most effective way she had discovered of communicating things that exceeded the range of practical language, and she heard him exhale against her hair with the quality of a man who has decided to accept victory without pushing further. The quilt lived at the foot of their bed through all of this, through the baby and the barn and the seasons and the paying of debts and the building of what they were building. It was worn now in places, from use and washing and time, the way things that are genuinely used became worn, and the wear was not damage but evidence, the material record of years. The log cabin pattern had faded slightly, the colors going softer, but the block with his name remained legible, the deep blue thread still clear against the lighter cotton. Alma married in 1881, a man named Robert Fairchild who was a lawyer's clerk in Abilene, and who was steady and pleasant, and who looked at Alma with the particular attentiveness that Ruth recognized as the real thing. Ruth and Clarence went to Abilene for the wedding, and it was a fine day, full of warmth, and Ruth danced with Clarence again on another wooden floor to another fiddle, and felt the difference between then and now, the weight of 3 years of marriage and a child and land that was beginning to yield and a life that had settled into something that was genuinely theirs. Dorothea Marsh, who came to Abilene for the occasion because Dorothea went everywhere that mattered, took Ruth's arm during the celebration and looked at her with the warmth of a friend who has watched something good happen over time. "You're happy," Dorothea said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ruth said. "Is it what you expected?" Ruth considered this. She thought about the dream and the needle and the dark early morning in February and the name stitched into the quilt. She thought about the roof and the well and the creek and the cottonwood trees. She thought about Edgar in his chair, and the quilt across his knees and Clarence's hand on her shoulder in the cold December afternoon. She thought about the baby's voice and the sewing table and the winter evenings and the spring and the way he said her name when something mattered. "No," she said, "it's better." Dorothea squeezed her arm. "It usually is," she said with great satisfaction. "When it's real, it usually is." The second child came in 1882. A daughter they named Clara, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother and who, from her earliest weeks, demonstrated a calm, observant quality that reminded Ruth powerfully of her father. Edgar Jr., who was now known simply as Eddie except in moments of formal discipline, received his sister with initial indifference that converted within a week to the proprietary pride of a 4-year-old. Who has discovered that a younger sibling can be an asset if managed correctly. Clarence held Clara in the first hour after the birth with the same expression he had worn holding Eddie, that unguarded openness that Ruth had come to think of as his true face, the one he kept behind the steady everyday one, the one that appeared when something had gotten past his careful borders. "She has your eyes," he said. "My mother's eyes," Ruth said. "They're coming around." He looked at her over the baby's head. "I like to think of it as hers," he said. In 1883, the Hayes City School Board, which had been run by a collection of men who had varying levels of actual interest in the education of the town's children, reorganized under new leadership and voted to expand the school to 2 rooms and to hire a second teacher. They also, after considerable discussion, voted to increase Ruth Keene's salary, which had not moved in 4 years, to something that more accurately reflected what her work was worth. The vote was 5-2, which meant that 2 men on the board had voted against the increase, and both of them received, in the weeks following, the particular treatment that their neighbors and wives and the mothers of schoolchildren administered to people who had been visibly wrong about something important, which is to say they were not mistreated, but they were not allowed to forget it either. Ruth took the increased salary with the same manner she took most things, without excess, but she told Clarence that evening, and she saw in his face the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a person he believes in receive what they deserve. "It should have happened 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you pleased?" "I am," she said. "It means more books for the school." He looked at her. "Ruth, and the roof on the schoolhouse needs looking at," she continued. The shingles on the north side have been concerning me since spring. Ruth, she looked up. You are allowed to be pleased for yourself, he said, not only for what you can do with it for others. She looked at him across the table in the evening light, with the noise of the children in the other room and the smell of supper, and the sound of the wind outside that she knew as well now as she knew anything. This man who had appeared on a road in May of 1878 with a torn coat and a patient expression, this man whose name she had known before she knew him, this man who had come to her fences and her well and her damaged roof and had stayed. "I know," she said. "I am pleased for myself." He nodded. The nod carried something that was not simple, that was the accumulated weight of every ordinary day they had spent together, and she felt it as she often felt the things he communicated without amplification, as a warmth that started in the center of her chest and moved outward. The years built on themselves in the way that good years do, each one adding to the previous without erasing it. Eddie grew tall and stubborn and brilliant with numbers, which meant that Ruth wrote the letter to the university at Lawrence that she had first thought of for her student Thomas years ago, and wrote it for her own son, and received back an informative reply about the preparatory education that would be needed. She set to work on it with the focused determination of a woman who has learned that most things are achievable if you break them into their components and address each one in order. Clara was quieter and more interior, a reader and a drawer, filling the margins of whatever paper she could find with small, careful pictures of the things she observed, the horses and the birds and the particular way the prairie light fell in the afternoon. She had Clarence's quality of stillness, the capacity to go very quiet and be entirely present in a way that made people feel she was genuinely paying attention, because she was. Ruth finished a second quilt in 1884, then a third, and the sewing table was worn smooth where her hands rested, and the baskets underneath were full of thread and fabric, and the small tools of a practice she had kept up across every season and difficulty. She made quilts for Alma and Robert when their first child arrived. She made one for Dorothea's daughter when she married. She was known for her quilts in Hayes City in the way that people become known for a particular excellence, and women came to her with fabric and requests, and she helped them as she had the capacity to. She never put another name in a quilt without knowing whose it was. She thought about this sometimes, about the February morning and the dream and what it had been. She was not a woman who could offer a credible explanation for it, and over the years she had stopped trying. Some things resisted explanation, and it was more honest to say so than to construct one that did not hold up. What she could say was that it had been real, that the name had come to her and she had written it into the quilt, and the man had come and she had known him and had loved him, and that this was not nothing, whatever its explanation. It was, in fact, more than most things she could have pointed to as certain. In the fall of 1885, on the anniversary of their wedding that they marked every year with the small private ceremony of a good supper and the evening to themselves after the children were in bed, Clarence took the quilt from the foot of the bed and spread it across the table as she had done on the Saturday morning 7 years before when she showed him the name. She came into the room and stopped. "I wanted to look at it," he said. He was sitting at the table, looking at the block with his name. The quilt was worn now, soft and faded, genuinely old in the way of things that have been genuinely used. "I look at it sometimes when you're not here," he said. "I'm telling you that." "I know," she said. "I can tell when it's been moved." He looked up. "You can. I keep it a certain way," she said. "You don't fold it quite the same." He was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of this mutual awareness. "Have you minded?" he said. She came to the table and sat down across from him, the quilt spread between them like a map. She looked at the name. Small, careful letters, deep blue thread, worn now but legible. She looked at the man who bore the name, this steady, private, honest man who had come down a road in a damaged coat and had stayed. "No," she said, "I have not minded." He pressed his thumb along the stitching in the way he always did, the same gesture from that first Saturday morning when the thing had undone the last of his careful distance, and she watched his face and saw it, the thing she had first seen then, the complete openness, the recovery of nothing, the full and irrecoverable arrival of a man in a life he had not expected. "I never recovered," he said, "from that morning when you showed me this." "I know," she said. "Do you know why?" She thought about this. "Because I knew you before I knew you," she said. "And when you understood that, there was nothing to protect against." He looked at her across the quilt, across the 7 years of winters and springs and children and harvests and grief and work, and all the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life built in a hard and beautiful country. He had the expression she loved best on him, the one that was not dramatic or performed, that was simply the plain face of a man who is exactly where he belongs with exactly who he is supposed to be with, and who knows it and does not require it to be larger or smaller than what it is. "I love you," he said, not for the first time, for the 10,000th time approximately. He said it the way he had said everything that mattered to him from the beginning, plainly and with the weight of full intention behind it. "I love you," she said back, the same way. The quilt was between them, and the evening was outside, and the children were asleep, and the land was theirs, and the life was theirs, built from a name in a dream, and a needle and a length of deep blue thread on a February morning, built from fences and wells and roofs and creeks, and a year of learning each other, and then another year and then more, built from everything that had come before and everything that was still ahead, the seasons still arriving, the work still continuing, the world still turning in the wide and patient way of the Kansas plains. In the morning there would be school and the children and the land, and all the 100 daily things that filled a life and made it real. But for now there was the quilt on the table and the lamplight and the man across from her with his thumb on the stitching of his own name, the name she had known before she knew him, the name that had come to her like a thing she had always had somewhere and only just remembered, and the fact of him, solid and present and recovered from nothing at all, and her own face in the lamplight, warm and clear and arrived. This was what she had been sewing toward. Not the quilt, though the quilt was beautiful and true. Not the name, though the name had been the beginning. The life, the whole, full, breathing, difficult and generous life on the other side of the thread. She reached across the quilt and put her hand over his, and his hand turned and held hers, and the evening settled around them in the deep and quiet way of things that are complete. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the prairie in its ancient, unhurried way, under a sky full of stars too numerous to count and too large to comprehend, and the Keene house sat solid in the dark with its lights on, and the quilt was spread on the table inside it, and in the corner of one worn and faded block, in thread that had lasted 7 years of use and washing and time, the name persisted, small and careful and blue, as certain as the first morning she had placed it there. Clarence Keene. His name, sewn in before she knew his face, and now she knew every line of it, every expression, every quality of silence and of speech, knew him in the way that years of real and honest living built in you, the bone-deep, unshakable knowing of a person you have chosen and been chosen by, and who has been worth every single stitch. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and there was nothing left unfinished between them, and nothing open that needed closing, and nothing owed that had not been repaid with interest in the currency of ordinary days. The lamp burned steadily. The wind moved through the grass. The children slept. The quilt held its name. And Ruth and Clarence Keene sat in the warm kitchen of the life they had made and were at peace with what they had built and with each other, and with the long, strange grace of having found the right thing and known it and kept it, which was, in the end, all that any of it had ever been asking of them.